Each of us should ask ourselves, if I get into a difficult situation, am I going to do what's expedient for me, or am I going to follow the crowd, or am I going to stand up and do what's right? Hello, this is Reasoning Through the Bible, and today we're going to meet some people that have that exact situation. We're going to meet some people that are put into a situation where they do what's expedient to them, and they don't stand up and do what's right. And so we're here in Matthew. We're in Matthew chapter 27. We're going to start in verse 11. At this point, Jesus has been arrested. We're in the last day of his life. Jesus has been tried in a mock kangaroo court by the Jewish leaders. He started to be beaten already, and he has been sent to the Roman governor Pilate. And so, Steve, what are we going to see here in this next section?
Well, again, Pilate is the Roman governor. We're going to see him addressing Jesus primarily with what he's been accused of, and that comes to the very first question. So we'll see Pilate not only addressing him in regards to what he's been accused of from a Roman sedition standpoint, but we also see Pilate trying several times to not condemn Jesus to death.
Pilate's doing everything he can to kind of squirm out of the situation that he's in. So, Steve, why don't you read today? Why don't we read Matthew 27, start in verse 11 and go down to 14?
Now, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed.
So in verse 11, what question does Pilate ask Jesus? What's his question?
Are you the king of the Jews? And I think that goes directly to the accusation that he was sedition, right, against Roman, because there was only one king, and that was Caesar.
Right. That was the excuse the Jewish leaders were using, is that this guy's claiming to be king instead of Caesar.
Correct.
And so Pilate asked him this question. Now, what's interesting is, what is the entire book of Matthew focused on presenting Jesus as?
The king of the Jews.
He's the king. So, yes, he is the king.
Right.
It's just he didn't look like what Rome would consider a king.
Right.
And he didn't look like what the Jewish leaders wanted to be as a king.
Right.
But he was indeed the king. And as we've gone through the book, again, Matthew goes out of his way to show many times that Jesus was indeed the king of the Jews. And so when Pilate asked the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" what did Jesus answer?
He basically says yes. He says, "You've said it yourself."
Yeah, it's the way you say. That's a yes.
Yep.
And then in verse 12, what did Jesus do? While he was being accused by the chief priest, what was Jesus's response?
Nothing. He didn't respond at all.
He responded nothing. He wasn't trying to get out of the charges. He voluntarily gave his life. His life wasn't taken. All along the way, Jesus voluntarily gave his life. He admits in front of Pilate, "Yes, I'm the king," in order to give Pilate some excuse for killing him. And so then the Jews stand up and make all these accusations, and he doesn't try to defend himself. So who is really the one causing Jesus to die? Jesus is.
Yeah, correct.
Even Pilate asked Jesus about the many accusations that the Jewish leaders were accusing him of, and Jesus answered not one word, it says in verse 13. So it says, when he was being accused, he answered nothing. He remained calm while being falsely accused. The impression I get here is that Jesus is not excited. He's not nervous. I think he was very calm. What personal traits must we have in order to remain calm while we're in a difficult situation or falsely accused? I think Jesus is showing a unique set of circumstances here.
Right.
And the reason I ask that is because as Christians, we will indeed be falsely accused.
Yeah.
We will be accused, are you a Christian? And will be put into very difficult circumstances. I heard about a man today that was a chaplain for a public service group, state agency. And because of his personal beliefs, they fired him. Mm-hmm. And so we should be careful and be tactful to people, but we should also be prepared as Christians. We will pay a price.
Right.
And so what personal traits should we have in order to be able to stick with what we believe and do it calmly in times of being falsely accused?
Well, I think we should have mildness and meekness and humbleness. And also in the situation, there's nothing that Jesus is going to be able to say. He's already gone through one rigged trial over at Caiaphas's house. He knows that he's in another rigged trial. So him offering a defense, is that really going to change anything? And so I would say no, and he knows that. So what good is it to offer a defense?
So this next section is where Pilate is really trying to avoid killing Jesus. But as Steve pointed out in our previous session, Pilate is in sort of a spot because he doesn't want a riot. He doesn't want to have to send in the troops to quell a riot, which would cause mass death. It makes him look bad to his leaders. And at the same time, things just work better if the population's at peace. So I'm going to read starting at verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that because of envy, they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And all the people said, "His blood shall be on us and on our children." So in verse 18, Pilate knows for what reason the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to be killed. And what was that reason?
Because of envy.
Because of envy.
Yeah, jealousy.
Pilate could tell. He's no dummy. He could tell, hey, these guys are having some sort of an interpersonal problem. It's not that this guy's really dangerous.
Right.
So Pilate knows immediately that Jesus is not dangerous.
Right.
That it's some sort of religious reason that these prideful leaders don't like Jesus.
And that it's an internal Jewish situation. I mean, he knows that as well from the leadership bringing him over to him. So he already knows that this is a internal Jewish thing, and that we can see by the fact that he's trying different ways to have Jesus released, that he doesn't see Jesus as being a threat per se to the Roman government. He doesn't see Jesus as a rabble rouser. He hasn't had any information or intelligence or anything else of Jesus being a person who is causing the public to rise up against Rome. And I can say that by the fact that if he was, he probably would have already been captured by the Roman government. This other person who he tries to release, Barabbas, he was a person who had been causing sedition and causing problems and stuff. That's why he was under arrest by the Roman government.
Correct. So Pilate knows that the real reason here is just because of envy.
Right.
But in the end, Pilate bows to the pressure of the Jewish leaders instead of doing what is right and defending an innocent man.
Yeah.
So Pilate gives in. He doesn't do what a leader should do, which is to be fair in the face of difficult circumstances.
And I would also say, though, he does what some leaders do from the standpoint that he is, in essence, working with other leadership in order for something to go in. So, yes, while he doesn't do what's morally right, he is doing something that we see amongst leadership all too often, where there's collusion among the leadership of not doing the right thing, but what's doing best for them and for their ruling over the people.
So then Pilate comes up with this man Barabbas. The text calls him a notorious prisoner. He's a bad guy.
Yeah.
And so there's a custom where he can release someone, and Pilate comes up with this idea, I'll bribe the crowd, and I can get out of killing an innocent man, Jesus, here by taking a really bad guy. Surely they won't take him, and contrast him with Jesus. And Pilate will say there, I'll force them to take Jesus, and I won't have to kill an innocent man. So he thinks they're going to choose Jesus to be released, and instead they choose Barabbas.
Right.
So Pilate now is in a spot, because now he's not only has released a prisoner, but now he's being forced to kill a man that he knows is innocent.
Right.
And in verse 21 to 23, Pilate has this conversation with the crowd, trying to find a way out of killing Jesus. He tries every way he can to get out of the responsibility of killing Jesus, who he knows to be innocent. We know this from verse 24, when he says he could not prevail, or he was getting nowhere, gaining nothing, some of the translations say. So Pilate was trying to reason with this crowd, but not succeeding. And then in verse 19, Pilate was already in the midst of this big crowd, in the midst of trying Jesus, and his wife sends him a note.
Right.
So what'd the note say?
Hey, don't have anything to do with him. I had a dream that this is an innocent person and you need to not get involved with this situation whatsoever.
And what's he doing when he gets this message? He's right in the middle of it. Right. Can't get out of it now. Yeah. Why didn't you tell me that an hour ago?
Yeah, and he's actually sitting on the judgment seat, the bema seat of outside in the courtyard.
So the wife's no help, for Pilate's already in the middle of it all.
Right.
Pilate really didn't want to deal with him. His wife really didn't want to deal with him. But what do they both end up doing? They're having to deal with him.
Right.
The wife's bad dream is showing that there are big things going on surrounding Jesus, so much so that the people around him are being affected. There's more going on here than just a physical arrest of a man. There's waves being made in the spiritual world to where this lady's getting this dream because of Jesus. We don't know whether this woman's dream was natural because she saw Jesus was innocent earlier and just heard that he was arrested, or whether it was some sort of a vision from God. We don't know. But Pilate's wife called him a just man. So she knew he was innocent.
Right.
Pilate knows he was innocent. The chief priests know he's innocent.
Right.
But they're all in a argument here over what to do with him.
Right. There's several things. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. Again, a few days earlier, Jesus had been welcomed into the city, denoting that he was the son of David, that he was being accepted as the Messiah.
People were waving palm branches and yelling, Hosanna to the son of David.
Right. But this isn't the people that are here. So I think it's reasonable to say that the people that are here that are crying, crucify him, are people that were not part of just a few days earlier, accepting him as the Messiah. And again, we know this is all rigged, right? We know that this is all put up. I think it's reasonable to say that these are a group of people, a crowd of people that the Jewish leadership has also gathered together in order to put this pressure on Pilate as well. I mean, it says there in verse 20, but the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. So this is not the same people that a few days earlier was accepting Jesus and worshiping him as his son, or accepting him as the Messiah and recognizing him as the son of David.
What I see is that the crowd there was just as fickle as Pilate.
Right.
they're persuaded to kill an innocent man. Verse 20 says the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd. So the chief priests there were persuading Pilate. They were persuading the crowds.
Right.
And so often the crowd goes in the wrong direction. We should be willing to stand up and do what's right, even if it goes against the crowd and the leaders. And so we should ask ourselves, if I was ever in this position as Pilate, and I've got people on both sides of me trying to get me to do something that I know is wrong, am I going to go along with the crowd, or am I going to cause an uproar if I do what's right? Am I going to do what's right or not? And here, the crowd gives in to the Jewish leaders.
Yep.
Pilate gives in to the Jewish leaders, and none of them do what's right.
Yeah, and in 24, Pilate says he's tried several times, and we get a sense of the crowd because he says when he saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, that's when he said he washed his hands of this innocent person. But I just want to mention that kind of gives you a picture of how intense the crowd was in regards to shouting for the crucify, and etc.
Yeah, this was a borderline riot.
Yeah.
Is what it says here. And now we got the famous scene where Pilate washes his hands, and he says, I wash my hands of this. And
right.
We still use that as a phrase in our language today. This is where it came from, was when Pilate washed his hands. Can Pilate really avoid responsibility here?
No, he can't.
Just symbolizing I'm done with this.
Right.
He's still responsible.
Correct. He's still the one that gives the order.
He even after the hand washing, calls him a just person. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent and yet condemned him anyway. The crowd in verse 25 says something very ironic. His blood be upon us and our children.
Right.
Why is that ironic? Simply because Jesus' blood, if you're covered by the blood, then what does that mean? Your sins are covered.
Right.
That was back in the symbolism of the Old Testament, with the Old Testament sacrifices, with the animal sacrifices and the Ten Commandments inside the temple. They would sprinkle the blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant that had the Ten Commandments in it. And that was a symbol of covering the violation of the Ten Commandments, the law, with the blood. And so when they say here, his blood be upon us, well, they didn't want his blood covering their sins. They're taking responsibility for his death. And so very ironic is what they say there.
Yeah, I want to point out too, Glenn, that this verse has been cited by anti-Jewish people through the centuries, actually, to justify their persecution and even killing the Jewish people because of this. But that's wrong. I mean, we've talked about that. We just talked about logic tells you that Pilate is also guilty as well, and it's the Roman people. Scripture is clear that Jesus is voluntarily offering himself up, and that it's God himself that's providing the sacrifice. Over in Isaiah 53:10, it says, but the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. So, again, it's a false argument to blame the Jewish people in general as a Christ killer and to be against them. Jesus offered himself up for the sins of the world, for you and I and everybody. It's not to be put on and blamed to one particular people or race or group of people or anything else. We're all guilty.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because one of the reasons we've mentioned so many times as we've gone through this, that Jesus was the one who gave his life. Mm-hmm. Nobody took it. Right. One of the reasons we mention that so much is because there have been anti-Semitic Christians. There have been Christians over the centuries that have unjustly blamed the Jews for killing Jesus.
Right.
And it's just not true. It comes from anti-Semitism. It comes from Jew hating. It comes from a bad place. And true Christians should cleanse themselves of any of those kind of thoughts, because the Jews are indeed God's chosen people.
Right.
And yes, they had responsibility.
Sure.
They were given great truths, And for the most part, they've not followed their Messiah, Jesus Christ. But they cannot be singled out as the blame for Jesus.
Right.
Another group that's singled out at times over the centuries was Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And they try to blame Rome for Jesus' death. And the way I would put it is this: the person responsible for killing Jesus, I've got the answer. It was me.
Right. Yeah.
I did it.
Yeah.
It was because of my sin that he voluntarily gave his life.
Correct.
And it's because of your sin. And so that's why we point this out. Nowhere along the line was Jesus out of control of the situation. He was in complete control. He's moving the people around him so that he goes to the cross. And so that's what's going on. And so we have here, I think, an interesting thing in the sense that there's this crowd of people that are whipped up by these Jewish leaders to the point where they were blaming an innocent man and almost causing a riot. And then we've got Pilate, who was also realizing Jesus was innocent, but Pilate had this position of power, had all these troops and the power of Rome behind him, and this crowd of commoners that both of them were really being manipulated by these rabble-rousers with these Jewish leaders. And nobody had the fortitude to stand up and do what was right in the face of this.
Yeah.
Okay, so in verse 25, the people make this very prophetic claim about the blood being on them. And so in this, how well is Pilate doing as a leader, would you say here?
He's passing the buck.
How well are the Jewish people doing?
They're accomplishing what their goal is. Their goal is to get Jesus killed. So I would say that they're progressing the way that their hearts are leading them to do. It's showing how their hearts are.
Is it difficult to be strong and clear in situations like this if you're an individual?
Yeah.
I would say, it's hard.
Yeah.
So tell us about Barabbas.
So Barabbas, that's actually a mashup of Barabbas, and we're told in other historical texts that his name is Barabbas. Probably he's referred to as, or it could be, I should say, that he's referred to as Barabbas, as to not confuse in regards to it, because we're also told in other sources that his first name was also Yeshua, and we've talked about Yeshua being Joshua, that we would say in English. And so his actual name was Yeshua Barabbas, or Joshua, son of the Father. And so you have another ironic situation going on in that here you have the true Joshua, son of the Father, the innocent one, and Jesus that is being offered to juxtapose another Joshua, son of the Father, Yeshua Barabbas. And the people are calling for Yeshua Barabbas in order to be freed, the guilty one, versus the true innocent one.
Yeah, Bar means son of.
Yep.
And Abba means father or daddy.
So I think that's interesting.
So the next section, we have Pilate is now turned Jesus over to the soldiers. So Steve, if you could read starting in verse 26 and go down through verse 31.
Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him.
If you liked what you heard, subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible today. Don't miss this opportunity to grow in your knowledge and love of God's Word. Subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible on your favorite podcast platform. So in verse 26, it just mentions in passing, after having Jesus scourged,
Right.
he handed him over to be crucified.
Right.
So what is this scourging that they're talking about? What is that exactly?
The scourging was where it would be a whip that would be taken, and it was made out of leather, had a handle on it, and they were long thongs of leather, and it would be taken and put across the person's back. Now, in the Jewish scourging in the Old Testament, they were to, as punishment, they would whip for 40 strokes or 41s. And so they had all these rules that to make sure they didn't go over 40 to count. But their particular tool or whip that they used was just that, just had leather, maybe with some knots tied in the end of it. On the Roman side, though, theirs was longer. It was also known as a cat o' nine tails. It had pieces of bone that were tied into the knots at the end. It had pieces of metal that were tied into the knots at the piece of the end. And so as they would scourge the person, they would whip him. It would come across their back. Many times the leather tassels, thongs would come wrapping around to the front of the body as well. And when they would take it, that bone or those pieces of metal would dig into the flesh. And then when the person that was meting out the punishment would pull back, it would pull back and make marks of the flesh and dig into the flesh as well. They would scourge him not only on his back, but it would also whip around on his head. So it didn't take very many lashes for a person to become a bloody mess, so to speak, through this scourging. And some people would even get to the point that they would even die from loss of blood from it. They would take them and tie them to a post with their hands so that they couldn't move, and then they would go about the scourging. It was just a cruel, cruel punishment.
And so think of a severe whipping is what this is. This is really bad punishment, scourging. Right. This is a really bad whipping. Think of these people as, this is the execution squad.
Right.
These weren't just, any given soldier is trained to kill people. That's what soldiers do.
Right.
But this was the execution squad. And so these people's job was to kill people. And so they were very accustomed to death.
Right.
And they were not here to try to do it nicely or to save a life. They're basically having fun with Jesus and they start out by whipping him very severely. And then from 27 to 31, the soldiers mock Jesus. And again, these are crude, tough men who have crude fun with the king of all creation.
Right.
And what makes this so severe is the contrast between these crude, probably uneducated, tough men whose job is to kill people all day long. And they're having fun with him, ridiculing him, teasing him, poking fun at him. And he, on the other hand, is beautiful, dignified, loving, pure, holy, good. And the only small comparison I could come up with is taking the most beautiful piece of art that you've ever seen and then just dragging it through the mud.
Right.
That would ruin it. Just because of the fact that it's the most beautiful piece of art makes it all the worse that you drag it through the mud. So we have these very crude human beings having fun with the most beautiful thing that ever crossed the earth, which is Jesus Christ. And so the contrast here is just striking. So if we think of what has happened to Jesus up to this point, into chapter 26, the guards spat in his face and punched him over and over again. They've now scourged him, whipped him very badly. Verse 29, we're going to see the crown of thorns put on him that cut in all the way to his skull bone.
Right.
He is stripped naked. They beat him with a stick in verse 30. Verse 32, he's so weak that he couldn't carry his own cross. And so the blood loss and the beatings, this is all before the cross,
right,
which is severe in and of itself.
Yeah.
On top of that, Jesus knew this was coming,
right,
which makes it all the worse because you know what's coming.
Right.
And all his earthly friends have abandoned him.
Yep.
He's about to be spiritually separated from the Father. He's been up all night.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's not through yet.
And it's not through yet.
Yeah. And this is the cup. This is the cup that he had asked the Father if it would be in his will. If this cup, if it can be done any other way, if this cup could be taken from him, but not his will, but the Father's will. This is the cup.
How does it make us feel if we realize he didn't have to do this?
Yeah.
But he did it anyway for us.
Right.
He did it for me.
Right.
He did it for you. He did it out of love for me and you to pay for our sin, to make a way for us to get back to the Father.
Right.
How does that make us feel?
I think what we're seeing is this is a depiction of how the evil the heart of men are. It's to go about with this cruelty and do the things that they're doing to an innocent person who they know is innocent. They know that he's innocent, and yet they are doing these things. It's just a depiction of how evil a man's heart can be to do these things.
To realize how he was treated when he was really wise and loving and pure and holy, and he's doing this for me. Mm-hmm. It just really, really humbles me to know that. And I would encourage all of our listeners, if you haven't really considered what Jesus did for you. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes we get into these theological debates, and all that tends to kind of turn to dust sometimes when we just realize the simple message that Jesus was beaten for me. He was scourged for me. He went to the cross for all of us to pay for our sins so that we could then be with him. He gave his life for us so that we would not be separated from God forever.
It says in verse 30, they spat on him. I just want the listeners just to think of that one thing of how that makes you, what comes into how that makes you feel if somebody were to spit on you. And that doesn't really harm you, but just think about just that alone. And here is God in the flesh back in the garden when they came from him. And he goes, why are you here? Why are you here with this big crowd? Peter cuts off the ear and he rebukes Peter. And he tells him, if I wanted to, I could call 10,000 angels, but he's not doing it. And so again, the restraint that he's having in order to go through this, I think is just another dynamic that's just, again, what you mentioned, Glenn. Think about what he went through for us. It's just heartbreaking and amazing.
When I was a kid, I once had somebody spit in my face. Mm. I can still smell it.
Yeah.
It's been decades. Well, I'm not a kid anymore. Surprise, surprise. But after all these years, I can still smell that smell of somebody spitting in my face. And to know that Christ was spat on several times, beaten with his fist, all these things. And he showed so much love. And he's the one that's worthy.
Right.
If you ever have any issues with Christianity, any issues with God, this act here of what he's doing and what he's about to do by dying on the cross and going through all this is the ultimate act of love. And I would encourage all of our listeners to consider Jesus. Consider the love that he expressed for us. And that's insurmountable. It's really indescribable. And we'll probably, on that note, pull it over because we're at the end of a section here. So we'll pull this over and pause for now. But the next time, we're going to meet a man named Simon, and we're going to go out to the place of the skull, to the cross. And so we'll learn that next time on Reasoning Through the Bible.